In the summer of 1925, the roads into Florida were so congested that the state was, in places, effectively full. Cars queued at the Georgia line. Hotels in Jacksonville rented out lobby chairs by the night. In Miami, men slept in shifts in rooming houses and paid for the privilege. And the railway that served the eastern coast of the state stopped accepting freight because its yards were so choked with unloaded boxcars that nothing could move. They were not coming for the weather, or not principally. They were coming to buy land, and most of them had no intention of ever seeing it. 3 years before the Wall Street crash, in a state with a population smaller than Brooklyn's, America ran the entire experiment. The leverage, the paper instrument that made the leverage possible, the promotional machinery, the celebrity endorsement, the outright fraud at the edges, the sudden absence of new buyers, and the discovery, always the same discovery, that a market can stop long before anybody rings a bell. This is the story of the Florida land boom, which is the most instructive American bubble precisely because it is the least famous. The instrument at the center of it was called a binder, and everything else follows from how it worked. A binder was an option. You agreed to buy a parcel of land, you signed a contract, and you put down a deposit, often around 10%, sometimes considerably less. The balance became due at a specified date, typically 30 days out, when the deed would be recorded and the transaction completed. What made it explosive was that the binder itself was assignable. In the interval before payment fell due, you could sell your contract to somebody else, who took on your obligation and paid you the difference between what you had agreed to pay and what they had agreed to pay you. You never owned the land. You never paid the balance. You owned a promise for 30 days and you sold the promise. Do the arithmetic on that, and the appeal is obvious. A 10% deposit means that a 10% rise in the land's price doubles your money. A 20% rise triples it. In a market climbing steadily every week, the binder was a machine for converting a small amount of cash into a large amount of cash, provided only that somebody stood behind you willing to take the contract off your hands before the 30 days elapsed. The young men who traded them were called binder boys. They arrived by the trainload in knickerbockers because of the heat, and they worked the streets and the hotel lobbies and the queues outside the sales offices, buying and reselling contracts, sometimes several times in a single day. A parcel of land could change hands 5 or 6 times before anybody recorded a deed on it, and every one of those transfers registered as a sale at a higher price. That last point is the mechanism worth carrying away from this entire episode. The price series that everybody watched, the one printed in the papers, the one that proved the market was rising, was generated almost entirely by people who never intended to own anything. It measured the enthusiasm of intermediaries, not the demand of occupants. Miami had something like 2,000 real estate offices by 1925, staffed by an estimated 25,000 salespeople, in a city whose entire population had recently been a fraction of that number multiplied a few times over. Nearly everybody in the town was selling land to nearly everybody else in the town. Building permits in Miami came to around $60 million in 1925, in a year when the same figure for cities several times its size was a fraction of that. A single newspaper carried more advertising in 1925 than any newspaper anywhere in the world had carried in a year, so thick with real estate pages that it had to be broken into sections merely to be handled. Now, how a swamp became the most desirable land in America. None of it would have been possible without 2 men who were already dead or finished by the time the boom began. Henry Flagler, who had been one of Rockefeller's partners in Standard Oil, spent the last 3 decades of his life pushing a railway down the east coast of Florida, and building a hotel at the end of each new stretch of track, St. Augustine, then Palm Beach. Then, in 1896, a settlement on Biscayne Bay that was incorporated as Miami largely because he had arrived. Henry Plant did the equivalent work on the Gulf side. Flagler's final act was the most extravagant railway project in American history, an extension running out over the water from the mainland to Key West, across open sea on viaducts and embankments, completed in 1912. He rode the first train down and died the following year. It is worth remembering that scale of ambition when the developers of the 1920s appear reckless. They were operating in a state whose entire modern existence had been produced by a man building a railroad into the ocean. What Flagler and Plant had created was access. What the 1920s added was mass access, and the difference between those two things is the whole boom. A railway carries the people who can afford a hotel at the end of it. A road carries everybody, in their own car with their own possessions, whenever they feel like leaving. The people who came that way even had a name. They were the tin can tourists, driving south with their food in cans and their tents on the running boards, camping in municipal grounds that Florida towns built specifically to receive them. They were not, on arrival, rich, but a very large number of them looked at the place and decided to find some money. Carl Fisher had made his money in automobile headlights, selling a compressed gas lamp system to the car industry, and then selling the company to Union Carbide, and he had spent a good deal of it on the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and on the Dixie Highway, a road running south from the Midwest towards Florida. He is the model of a certain kind of American operator, a promoter who genuinely builds the thing. What he built was Miami Beach. The barrier island east of Miami was mangrove swamp, and Fisher dredged the bay bottom and pumped it ashore to make dry land, cleared the mangroves, laid streets, planted imported topsoil and put up hotels, polo grounds and a golf course. Then he advertised it relentlessly to the north, most famously with an electric sign in Times Square reading, in the middle of a New York winter, that it was June in Miami. That is the boom's first ingredient, and it is real rather than fraudulent. Fisher's land had genuinely not existed a few years earlier, and now it did, and it was genuinely valuable. The problem with a boom is never that its founding proposition is false. It is that a true proposition, extended by leverage to people who cannot evaluate it, becomes indistinguishable from a false one. George Merrick was building something quite different and rather more admirable. His development southwest of Miami was called Coral Gables, and it was planned in the Mediterranean revival style with genuine coherence, architectural controls, plazas, entrances, a grand hotel, a university endowed with his own land, and a canal system. Merrick was not selling raw acreage. He was selling a designed city, and much of what he built is still standing and still pleasant to walk around, which cannot be said of most speculative development of any era. The Venetian pool, cut out of a coral rock quarry, is still open. To sell it, he assembled the most extraordinary marketing operation of the decade. Fleets of buses bringing prospects down from the north, orchestras, free lunches, and a speaker. William Jennings Bryan had been Secretary of State, and 3 times the Democratic nominee for president, and the most famous orator in the United States for 30 years. He had prosecuted the Scopes trial in Tennessee in the summer of 1925, and died a few days after it ended. In the years before that, he sat on a platform beside the water at the Venetian pool in Coral Gables and lectured crowds on the merits of Florida real estate. He was paid a reported $100,000 a year for it, half in cash and half in land, which tells you both what the promoters thought his voice was worth and how much of the local economy was denominated in the thing being sold. A man of enormous public standing was being compensated, in part, with the very asset he was promoting, so that his personal fortune depended on the audience believing him. Addison Misner was an architect of enormous charm, considerable talent, and no financial discipline whatsoever. He had made Palm Beach look the way Palm Beach looks, inventing a Spanish Mediterranean idiom out of a genuinely deep knowledge of Iberian building and a willingness to fake anything he could not source. His workshops manufactured antique roof tiles and distressed ironwork to order. In 1925, he launched Boca Raton, which was to be the most luxurious resort in the world, with a 100-foot-wide boulevard, a cathedral, and a hotel. He raised money on the strength of his name, and a list of investors that included some of the most recognizable families in America. He got a hotel built. The rest of it went down with the boom, and the company failed the following year. D.P. Davis dredged 2 islands out of Tampa Bay, on the other side of the state, and produced the single purest illustration of the whole phenomenon. He was selling building lots on land that, at the moment of sale, was still underwater. The fill had been surveyed and platted but not yet pumped. 300 lots went in 3 hours. People queued overnight and bought parcels they could not stand on the strength of a plan and a dredge. It worked, in the sense that the islands were in fact completed and are a pleasant part of Tampa today. It also tells you the exact temperature of the market. Buyers had stopped requiring the land to exist. Now the reasons it happened here: because the boom was not arbitrary and Florida was not chosen at random. The first reason is the automobile. In 1920, there were a few million cars in America. By the middle of the decade, there were far more, and they had turned a 2-day rail journey into something a middle-class family could do themselves, with their possessions, on roads that were being built specifically to bring them. The second is that the American middle class had money and a new relationship with credit. Installment buying had normalized the idea of paying for a thing over time while enjoying it now, and the stock market had been rising, and there was a general and not unreasonable sense that the country had entered a period of permanent prosperity. The third is that Florida made itself deliberately attractive to wealth. Florida had amended its constitution in 1924 to prohibit exactly the taxes that were rising elsewhere. No state income tax and no inheritance tax shall be levied. That was aimed directly at rich Northerners deciding where to establish residence, and it worked, and it is still working a century later. There is a fourth reason, and it is macroeconomic rather than local. American credit was unusually cheap in 1924 and 1925, and part of the reason had nothing to do with Florida or even with America. The Federal Reserve had eased deliberately in 1924, with an eye on helping Britain return to the gold standard at the pre-war parity. A lower American interest rate made it easier for gold to stay in London, rather than being pulled across the Atlantic. Whatever the merits of that as international policy, the domestic consequence was a wall of cheap money looking for a return in a country that already believed it had entered a permanent boom. It went into installment credit, into equities, and into Florida. It is a pattern worth noticing whenever a national mania appears to be about one asset. The asset is where the money went, not why there was money. Nor were the people describing the boom neutral observers of it. The newspapers carrying those record volumes of real estate advertising were, by 1925, financially dependent on the thing they were reporting. That does not require anybody to be corrupt. It only requires an editor to be enthusiastic about the industry paying for the presses, which is the natural human response and requires no encouragement at all. And the last of them is the simplest. The winters are warm, the state is long and coastal, and a very large number of Americans genuinely did want to live there. The boom was not built on a lie. It was built on a truth that arrived 30 years early and was financed as if it had arrived already. The selling machinery deserves its own description because it was industrialized in a way that would not look out of place today. A prospect in Ohio or New York would answer an advertisement and be brought south, frequently at the developer's expense, on a chartered bus or railway car. On arrival, they were fed, entertained, given a tour, and delivered to a platform where a speaker, sometimes a famous one, explained what Florida was about to become. Then they were walked onto the property itself, where salesmen worked the crowd individually, and where a band and a free lunch were doing the emotional work that the balance sheet could not. The instrument being sold at the end of that day was a binder, which required a modest deposit and could be signed on the spot. That is the design, an afternoon of managed enthusiasm, terminating in a commitment small enough to make in the moment and legally binding enough to be worth something the next morning. And a great deal of what was sold that way did not exist in any meaningful sense. A subdivision could be created by surveying a tract, drawing streets on a plat, recording it with the county, and selling the resulting rectangles. No road had to be built, no drainage had to be dug. The plat was a legal object, and the legal object was what changed hands. Some of those developments were built, some were built decades later, and some were never built at all. The northern states noticed the money leaving and fought back, which is a part of the story almost nobody tells. Bankers' associations in the Midwest and New England ran public campaigns discouraging Florida investment. State officials warned depositors. Newspapers in Ohio and Massachusetts published dire accounts of what buyers were actually getting for their deposits. There was self-interest in it. Every dollar sent to Miami was a dollar not in a local bank, but the warnings were substantially accurate. They had no effect worth measuring. That is the recurring finding of every episode this channel covers. Accurate public warnings, issued in good time by credible institutions, are almost perfectly ineffective against a rising price. The price is the argument, and it is being made every week, and no one's pamphlet can compete with it. Where there is that much money moving on that little verification, the fraud arrives on its own. Charles Ponzi arrived in Jacksonville in 1925, having served his federal sentence for the Boston postal coupon scheme that already bore his name, and went into land. His operation was called the Charpon Land Syndicate, and it offered investors a stake in Florida property with returns that would have been remarkable if they had been possible. He was selling 23 lots to the acre in tracts near Jacksonville, a good deal of which was swamp. An acre is roughly the size of a football field. 23 building plots in that space is not a subdivision, it is a diagram. He was indicted under Florida's trust laws, jumped bail, and was picked up in Texas trying to leave the country as a crewman on a freighter. It is worth being fair about the scale of him, though. Ponzi was a small operator in Florida, and the reason he matters is not the money he took. It is that a convicted swindler, released from prison and nationally notorious, could walk into that state and immediately find customers. When a market will buy from him, the market will buy from anybody. The first thing to break was not confidence. It was logistics, and that is the detail that gets left out of every short account of this episode. A land boom is only worth anything if the land can be built on, and building requires cement, lumber, steel, tiles, and fittings, all of which had to come into Florida from somewhere else. The state manufactured almost none of it. Everything arrived by rail down the peninsula or by ship into a handful of harbors, and by 1925, both routes had jammed solid. In August 1925, the Florida East Coast Railway declared an embargo, refusing to accept freight for shipment into the boom districts. No freight to be accepted except foodstuffs, fuel, and perishables. The railway had thousands of loaded cars sitting in its yards that nobody could unload, because there was nowhere to put the contents and no labor free to move them, and the whole system had seized. Think about what that does to a market built on binders. The value of a lot rests on the assumption that a house will stand on it. If cement cannot be delivered for 6 months, construction stops, and the man who bought a lot intending to build discovers he cannot build, and the man who bought a binder intending to sell it discovers that the buyer he was counting on has gone quiet. The embargo did not cause the collapse on its own. What it did was remove, in a single administrative act, the mechanism by which speculation was supposed to turn into houses. From August 1925 onwards, the market was running on resale alone. Then a ship turned over in the mouth of the harbor, and Miami's alternative supply route closed too. In January 1926, a Danish schooner called the Prince Valdemar, being converted into a floating hotel, capsized while under tow in the narrow entrance channel to Miami Harbor and settled across it. Nothing of size could get in or out. Salvage in those conditions was slow and awkward, and the channel stayed blocked for the better part of a month, with vessels loaded with building material anchored offshore. 2 blockages, one on rails and one on water, in a state that produced nothing it needed. By the spring of 1926, the boom was visibly over. Prices in Miami had stopped rising in the autumn of 1925, and once they stopped rising, the binder became a liability rather than an instrument. The whole point of holding one was that somebody would relieve you of it at a higher price, and when nobody did, the balance fell due and had to be found in cash. That is the specific way leverage kills. Not gradually as prices decline, but abruptly on a date, when an obligation matures and the plan for meeting it has evaporated. Binder holders defaulted in numbers. Deposits were forfeited, the sales offices emptied, and the binder boys went north. It is worth pausing on how quiet the top was, because people expect a crash to announce itself. There was no panic in Miami in the autumn of 1925. There was no single day on which the market fell. What happened was that the queue thinned. The trains from the north carried fewer speculators, the sales offices had slower afternoons, and a binder that would have found a buyer in a day took 3 days, then a week, then did not find one. That is what the end of a leveraged market actually looks like from inside it, and it is why so few people get out. A crash gives you a reason to act. A slow disappearance of buyers gives you only the hope that next week will be better, which is not obviously wrong until the day the balance falls due. And then, into a market that had already broken, came the weather. The hurricane came ashore in the early hours of the 18th of September, 1926, directly over Miami. It was an extremely intense storm, and it arrived in a city that had been built at enormous speed by people with no local experience of hurricanes at all. A place whose entire population had roughly tripled in a few years, most of them newcomers who had never seen one. The most terrible detail of that night is what happened in the eye. The wind dropped, the sky cleared, and thousands of people came out into the streets in the belief that it was over. It was not over, it was half over. The second half arrived from the opposite direction and caught them outdoors. The Red Cross put the dead at 372, with more than 6,000 injured and tens of thousands left homeless. At Moore Haven, on the southern shore of Lake Okeechobee, the low earth dike gave way and the lake came into the town. 2 years later, a second storm crossed Lake Okeechobee in September 1928, and the dike failed on a far larger scale. The water went out across the farming settlements of the Glades, and killed something in the region of 2,500 people, most of them black agricultural laborers, many of them buried in mass graves and uncounted for decades. It remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history, and it is very little known. The storms did not cause the collapse of the land boom. That is worth stating plainly, because the hurricane is usually given the role. The market had turned a year before the 1926 storm, for entirely financial reasons. What the hurricanes did was destroy the possibility of the recovery that everybody in Florida was waiting for, and they did it by supplying, in the most vivid way imaginable, the single fact that the promotional literature had omitted. There is one more thing to say about that storm, and it belongs to this channel's subject rather than to meteorology. Miami in 1926 had no building code worth the name for wind. It had been thrown up at maximum speed by contractors working faster than any inspection regime could follow, in a state where the profitable thing was to complete and sell rather than to build well, and where almost nobody involved had lived through a hurricane. Roofs were not tied down, walls were not braced. The damage was not simply a function of the wind speed, it was a function of how the boom had built. That is the same finding London reached after 1666, and that every city reaches eventually, usually once. A construction boom sets the standard of the building stock for the next 50 years, and the moment when standards are cheapest to enforce is precisely the moment when enforcing them is least popular, because every delay costs a developer money in a rising market. The bill arrives later, in one night, and it is paid by whoever happens to be living in the houses. The consequences ran through the banking system next, in the way these things always do. Florida's banks had lent against land at boom valuations and had taken land as collateral, and when the valuations went and the borrowers went, the loans on their books were secured by parcels nobody would buy. Bank failures ran through the state and into Georgia through the interlocking chains that then characterized Southern banking, where one holding company's failure closed dozens of nominally separate institutions in a week. The way Southern banking was organized made that worse in a specific and avoidable manner. Rather than large branch networks, the region ran on chains, nominally independent banks under common ownership or interlocking control, holding deposits with one another and lending to one another's affiliates. It looked like a diversified system of many separate institutions. It behaved like one institution with many front doors. So when the largest of those chains failed in 1926, it did not take down one bank. It closed scores of them across Florida and Georgia within days, in towns that had no connection to Miami real estate whatsoever, because their local bank's reserves had been sitting in the vault of a sister institution that had lent them against platted swamp. Depositors in places that had never heard of a binder lost their savings to one. By 1928, Florida was in a depression of its own, with municipalities that had issued bonds for streets and drainage in anticipation of populations that never arrived. Several of them defaulted. Coral Gables, the best planned development of the whole boom, was in serious trouble. Merrick lost control of his company and finished his life running a real estate office and, laterally, as the county postmaster. Carl Fisher lost almost everything, partly in Florida and partly in a second scheme at Montauk on Long Island that was meant to be the northern counterpart to Miami Beach. Misner's company failed, D.P. Davis went overboard from an ocean liner in the Atlantic in 1926 in circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained, having insured his life heavily. The municipal wreckage lasted longest and is the least visible part. Towns had issued bonds to pay for streets, sewers, bridges, and drainage on the strength of the population that was obviously coming, and the bonds were long and the population was not. When the tax base failed to appear, the debt service did not adjust. Florida cities defaulted through the 1930s in numbers that were extraordinary even by the standards of that decade, and several of them were still working through the consequences after the Second World War. There is also a physical residue that has never gone away. The subdivisions platted on paper in 1925 and never built remained recorded in county registries. Thousands of tiny lots, often on land that was wet, remote, or without legal access, owned by heirs of northern buyers who had long since stopped paying attention. Florida planners call them antiquated plats, and they are still a live problem. Parcels too small to build on under modern codes, with ownership scattered across generations of people who may not know they own anything at all. A speculative afternoon in 1925 produced land title problems that outlived everybody involved. Florida is worth studying because it happened first, and because everybody who lived through the second one had already seen the first. The collapse ran 3 full years ahead of Wall Street. Land prices in Miami peaked in the autumn of 1925 and were falling through 1926, when the stock market still had 3 years of climbing left to do. The same country, the same decade, the same credit conditions, the same conviction that a new era had arrived, and one part of it had already been through the entire cycle, while the other was still accelerating. That is not an argument that people are stupid. It is something more interesting and more uncomfortable. Everybody in America read about the Florida bust. It was extensively covered. The hurricane in particular was national news, and the phrase Florida real estate became a synonym for folly almost immediately. None of that transferred to the stock market, because the lesson was filed under Florida rather than under leverage, which is the general failure. A bubble teaches a very specific lesson to the people burned by it, about the particular asset that burned them, and a very general lesson to nobody. The Binder Boys of 1925 did not become cautious investors. They became people who did not buy Florida land. The mechanism, a small deposit, an assignable contract, a price series generated by intermediaries who never intend to take delivery, moved on to margin accounts and did it again. The modern version of the binder is not hard to find, and it has never really gone out of use. Off-plan property is routinely sold on a deposit against completion years away, and in hot markets, those purchase contracts get assigned before the building is finished, at a profit, to buyers who assign them again. The mechanics are identical. A small sum controls a large asset, the contract is transferable, and the reported prices are set by people who have no intention of ever holding keys. It shows up in other forms too. Any market where a deposit or a margin controls a multiple of itself, and where the position can be passed on before settlement, will generate the same shape: a smooth ascent in the price series, a widening gap between the recorded transactions and the number of people who actually want the underlying thing, and a break that arrives on a settlement date rather than as a gradual decline. The tell is always the same, and it is not the price. It is the ratio between transactions and occupancy. When a market's volume is being produced by people who will never use what they are buying, the volume is not evidence of demand. It is evidence of a queue, and a queue is a structure that looks identical whether it is lengthening or about to disperse. There are 3 specific things in this story worth keeping, and they are not moral observations. The first is the price series problem. When the observable prices in a market are being set by people who never intend to hold the asset, the price is a measure of trading conditions rather than a value, and it will keep rising smoothly right up until the moment the intermediaries stop, at which point it does not decline, it stops existing. There is no orderly market on the way down because there was never a market, only a cue. The second is the physical constraint. Every asset boom that requires something to be built eventually meets the actual supply of cement, labor, land, or electricity. The financial claim can be created in seconds, and the physical thing cannot, and the gap between them is where the collapse begins. In Florida, the gap became visible as a railway embargo and a ship in a channel, which is a satisfyingly literal version of a very general phenomenon. The third is the fixed date obligation. Leverage does not kill a speculator by making them poorer as the market falls. It kills them on the day a payment is due, and it does so regardless of whether they were right about the long-run value of what they bought. Almost everybody who lost money in Florida in 1926 was correct about Florida. The state's population is now more than 20 million people, and the swamp that D.P. Davis sold underwater is a desirable address. They were right, and the date beat them. The most awkward part of the whole episode is that the physical legacy is excellent. Coral Gables is one of the better planned communities built in America in the 20th century and is now expensive. Miami Beach exists because a headlight manufacturer pumped a bay bottom onto a mangrove swamp. Davis Islands is a desirable Tampa neighborhood. Boca Raton got its hotel. The University of Miami, endowed with Merrick's land, is still there. So the boom built real things and ruined the people who financed them, which is a more common outcome than the tidy morality tale allows. Speculative manias are not purely destructive. They are a wasteful and brutal method of getting infrastructure built early, in which the assets survive, and the first generation of owners does not. Somebody enjoys the streets and the drainage and the hotels. It is simply not the people who paid for them. That is the useful ending, and it is not a comforting one. The people who bought binders in Miami in the summer of 1925 had the correct view of the American future: warm weather, air travel, retirement migration, air conditioning, a century of Northerners moving south. They were early by about 30 years, and they had financed a 30-year view with a 30-day contract. And the difference between those two numbers is the whole of the disaster. There is one last thing worth noticing, and it concerns the word bubble itself. It implies something empty, and that is why the metaphor is misleading. Florida in 1925 was not empty. It contained dredges, cement, surveyors, architects of real ability, a genuine climate advantage, a tax regime designed to attract capital, and a demographic trend that has run in the same direction for 100 years since. Almost everything in it was solid except the terms. That is why these episodes are worth studying one at a time, rather than treating them as a single recurring folly. The question is almost never whether the underlying idea is sound. It is whether the financing matches the time the idea will take. Get that wrong and being correct is no protection at all, which is the least intuitive lesson in the whole subject, and the one that has to be learned again in every generation. They were not wrong about Florida. They were wrong about September.